evening. I'm going to give a little context at the beginning, and then I'm going to introduce Peter. So we've had a number of webinars on Gaza, on the Gaza conflict, and I think it would be useful for us to have some context regarding Mass Peace Action's position. So MAPA, Mass Peace Action, views the October 7th action by Hamas and other resistance groups as a military action against oppression and occupation, which also included attacks on unarmed civilians. We condemn any military group using force against civilians, and we seek to uphold international law. Israel's long history of apartheid and colonization, and then its ethnic cleansing and genocide after October 7th, are completely unacceptable. We condemn them and demand an end to U.S. complicity and support for Israel's crimes. So I just thought it was important to set that context. So for tonight's webinar, we are so excited to welcome Peter Beinart as our speaker. I think many of you may know him. Peter is professor of journalism and political science at the Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He's also editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and he also writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack. And I'm going to put those links in the chat. Okay. So we invited Peter because he has been an influential voice on this topic, and he is very thoughtful in his analysis, as those of you who read his Substack or listen to his podcast will know. So the format for this evening is that Peter's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We're going to disable the chat while he's speaking so that we can give him our full attention, and so as not to distract us from listening. And so Peter, you would like us to ask you the questions that we discussed?
That'd be great.
Okay, so with that, welcome, Peter Beinart.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Peter, how do you make sense of the current moment in Israel-Palestine?
So thanks for having me. That's a big question. I think that just to start with Gaza, the fundamental reason that the people of Gaza represent a threat to Israel, I will talk about Hamas in particular later, and what I think were its immoral and attacks on civilians on October 7th. But in order to understand the conflict, I think it's important to understand that the people of Gaza in general have represented a threat to Israel for long before Hamas was created in 1987. And the reason that people in Gaza represent a threat to the state of Israel is that most of the people from Gaza, their families are from Israel. That most of the people in Gaza, 70, 80% of people in Gaza are from families of refugees who were expelled or maybe fled in fear during Israel's War of Independence, which Palestinians call the Nakba, between 1947 and 1949. So the threat that people in Gaza pose to Israel is their desire to return. And that has been a threat to Israel and its identity as a Jewish state since literally the moment that they were expelled behind Egyptian lines to this territory that became the Gaza Strip. And the reason their presence constitutes a threat is that Israel was created to be a state in which Jews have supremacy, in which Jews are a large majority, at least of the people who are allowed to participate politically. So, and that Israel is constructed in large measure on the ruins of Palestinian towns and villages that were destroyed in 1948. So the presence of all of these people, this is, of course, they're Palestinian refugees also in the West Bank, in other countries, but Gaza is a particularly very, very large concentration of refugees crammed into a very small area. And their desire to return constitutes a threat to a Jewish state that is built on the idea, essentially, that Jews are in charge. And so if there are large and is essentially constructed for the benefit of Jews, not the benefit of Palestinians. So the prospect of a lot of Palestinians going back from Gaza to the places they were from really starts to threaten and undo the very basis of Israel as a Jewish state. And I think this is really kind of at the heart of the problem that Gaza has always represented for Israel. It's why even when people in Gaza have resisted in less violent ways, for instance, during the Great March of Return in 2018, which was not entirely but largely nonviolent, with people literally just walking to the fence that separates Gaza from Israel, that Israel responded with a tremendous amount of military force, leading to the maiming and injuring of many, many people. Because even though most of those people were not armed, they represented a threat because they were trying to return to territories that to territories they're from. Israel is so that I think is really at the core of kind of the dynamic that exists between Israel and the people of Gaza, which is a dynamic that, again, it far predates Hamas. To understand the rise of Hamas in recent years, I think one has to understand what has happened to other Palestinian political efforts. Palestinians for the PLO, the kind of umbrella Palestinian political organization since the 1960s, for a long time pursued the idea of what it called a secular democratic Palestine, essentially one state in which Israel would be overturned, and there would be a secular democratic Palestine, the kind of state that Palestinians believe should have been created at the end of British colonial rule. A debate started in the 1970s that culminated in 1988, in which the PLO made a historic concession. They said, we're going to give up on the idea of this entire territory being one secular democratic Palestinian state. We're going to accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, 22% of what was British mandatory Palestine. And to understand the rise of Hamas, one has to understand, I think, that Palestinian concession did not succeed. The central argument that Hamas has been making, really since its very early period, was that Palestinians accepted Israel's legitimacy, Israel's in 78% of mandatory Palestine, but did not get, as a result of that concession, a sovereign state of their own. And so I think central to Hamas's argument this entire period has been that Hamas is that concession was a mistake. That, first of all, Hamas is opposed to that concession ideologically because they reject the legitimacy of a Jewish state within any borders. But beyond that, they also just think it was a political failure because that concession did not actually lead Israel to do things like stopping settlement growth, let alone uprooting settlements in large numbers, or essentially accepting the idea that Palestinians deserve to have a sovereign state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The Hamas's success politically, I think, is partly the result of the fact that Israel and the United States have essentially defeated a whole series of other forms of Palestinian political resistance to Israeli oppression, a series of forms of resistance that I think are much more ethical than the attacks on than the attacks on October 7th, which included attacks on unarmed Israeli civilians. So, for instance, the Palestinians in 2005 launched the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which was a nonviolent movement speaking in the language of human rights and international law. In so doing, they were in some ways taking up the call that people had been making for a long time, that Palestinians should resist nonviolently. In fact, Palestinians have been resisting nonviolently for a long time, in addition to also resisting violently. But it wasn't as if it wasn't as if the Israeli government or the American government embraced this Palestinian nonviolent resistance. To the contrary, the BDS has essentially been criminalized in the United States, in many parts of the United States. If you support boycotting Israel, you can't be employed by state government, for instance, right? So again, this is, I think, when Palestinians went to the International Criminal Court and to the United Nations, time after time, the U.S. vetoed resolutions that would have condemned Israeli behavior. The U.S. made sure that the International Criminal Court did not launch investigations into Israel's control over millions of Palestinians who lack basic human rights. And again, the other strategy that Palestinians employed in the West Bank was what you could call a collaborationist strategy. The strategy of Mahmoud Abbas was, if we work with the Israeli government in the West Bank, and we show that we can be trusted to work with Israel to make sure that Palestinians don't commit armed attacks on Israelis, then we will win the trust of Israel, and they will allow us to have a state of our own. That strategy also failed. Mahmoud Abbas has not been able to stop settlement growth at all. I'm not suggesting that there may not have been Palestinian political mistakes along the way, but the central point I want to try to make in terms of understanding October 7th and understanding the political support that Hamas now has is that it has to be understood within the context of the failure of a series of other Palestinian efforts at resistance against Israeli oppression. To say that one should understand that context, again, is not to say that I justify attacks on civilians. I don't. I'm opposed to attacks on civilians. But Israel has actually created a context and the United States that actually empowered Hamas, because Israel and the United States discredited and defeated other Palestinian efforts at gaining Palestinian freedom that did not involve attacks on civilians. We have now you have a situation in which Israel had a strategy of dealing with with Gaza, and that strategy was that they thought that Hamas would. Israel's strategy was that it thought that it could occasionally have military conflicts with Hamas, but essentially that Hamas would act as a kind of subcontractor in Gaza, like the Palestinian Authority was doing in the West Bank, which is essentially that Hamas would control other armed groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that Hamas would be focused on governance inside of Gaza, and that therefore Israel could essentially turn its attention away from the Palestinians, focus on normalization with Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, and it could manage this situation. Basically, I think the Israeli leaders felt that they could manage a population of Palestinians who lacked basic human rights. Again, Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza in different ways live under the control of the Israeli state, but they're not citizens of the Israeli state. They can't vote for the government whose decisions impact every aspect of their lives. Israel thought that Israel felt that it could manage this situation without giving Palestinians rights, either in their own state or within the one state that exists between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. It felt that it could manage this situation through a series of carrots and sticks, right? The carrots would be that it would allow more Palestinians to go from the Gaza Strip into Israel to work. The sticks would be that if Hamas fired rockets, Israel would bomb Gaza and create what they called deterrence. I think what October 7th showed was that management strategy is a failure. And Israelis, I think, recognize that. And Israelis essentially grasping for some new strategy now, that they realize that managing the Palestinians without basic rights in the way they had been actually turns out not to be a safe strategy for Israel, because it was in the context of that strategy that you saw the October 7th attack. And so what I would like Israelis to recognize and Americans to recognize is that there is no way to safely manage a group of people to whom you are denying the most basic fundamental human rights. Because when you deny people basic rights, you inflict tremendous amounts of violence upon them. And when you do that, that violence sooner or later in some form or another is likely to come back and endanger you. That there is no safety for Israeli Jews if there is not safety for Palestinians, and there can never be safety for Palestinians if Palestinians don't have freedom. But unfortunately, given the political currents in Israel, which are very far to the right, and I think that the rightward drift of Israeli politics is partly because of the impunity that Israel has had because of American policy, that essentially Israel has paid no political cost for electing political leaders who are openly support an apartheid state in perpetuity. And because Israel has moved in that political direction, there are not very many Israeli Jews who are learning the lesson of October 7th that Israeli Jews will not be safe until Palestinians are free. But they are recognizing that managing a population that doesn't have basic rights is much more difficult than they thought. And it's in that context that I am very, very frightened that many Israeli leaders are now drawing the conclusion that if you can't manage this population of people to whom you deny human rights, the only solution is to try to get rid of them, or at least as many of them as you can. And so we've seen since October 7th that a whole range of Israeli political leaders, including, according to reports, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, have been pushing the government of Egypt to open its doors so that people in Gaza will leave. And it's clear to everybody, I think, who pays attention to this, that if people in Gaza leave Gaza, they will not be allowed by Israel to return, just as their parents and grandparents and great-parents were not allowed to return when they were expelled in 1948 or subsequently to 1948. And so Israel has created a situation in its response to the October 7th massacre, in which Gaza has become unlivable, uninhabitable for human beings. I think 85% of people have been forced from their homes, 70% of homes damaged or destroyed. Very large percentage of people, I've seen the figure of 40%, I've even seen higher, at risk of famine. The potential for tremendous death from disease because of the breakdown of medical and hospital and public health services. Essentially, I think as Israel has made Gaza unlivable, they have created more pressure on Egypt to allow people to leave. Egypt is resisting that. But I think that there are many people in the Israeli government whose strategy is, since we won't give these people freedom, and since we've turned out we can't manage our oppression of them very effectively, what we need to do is basically try to get rid of them as many as possible. And Israel is doing that by making Gaza unlivable and simultaneously pressuring Egypt and asking other countries to pressure Egypt to open its doors so that a significant part of the population in Gaza will leave. In the West Bank, I think it's a bit different. I think what you see in the West Bank is Israel pushing people out of Area C, which is the 60% of the West Bank that is under direct Israeli control, and pushing them into smaller Palestinian population enclaves in the urban areas, in areas A and B. But this is really, and I'll end here, something that is very, I would say, somewhat horrifying for me to observe. I often find myself, honestly, at a bit of a loss of words. As much as after October 7th, I had one set of emotions that I struggled to kind of really felt overwhelming, which was my grief for for the Israeli Jews and others who were killed on October 7th, and my grief and fear for the hostages, that is still something which is still very, very much present for me. We have the names of all of the hostages on our refrigerator door, so we see them multiple times a day, those names. Since then, that initial emotion has been added to this sense of, I can only use the word horror, that my people, a people who we know in our bones has such a deep history of expulsion, oppression, a mass murder that is kind of resonates throughout so many of our family histories and our communal memories, that a state that speaks in our name could be doing this to another group of people. To me, if I try to think of this in religious terms, in Jewish religious terms, it constitutes a chilul Hashem, which is a desecration of God's name. That human beings are supposed to model God's love and God's mercy and God's compassion. And so when we do the opposite, then we actually desecrate the name of God. And I feel that that's what's being done in Gaza today. So I'll just happily answer any questions folks
have. Peter, did you want to say anything more about how you make sense of the moment in the United States?
Sure, that's a whole other subject. So it seems to me that being in solidarity with Palestinians has taken on a significance for American progressives that is greater than it ever has before. That we are in one of these moments that periodically happen. I think the anti-Vietnam War movement was a moment like this. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, perhaps the moments of rallying around American policy in Central America, in which a group of Americans, not all Americans, but progressive Americans, essentially see their deepest values at stake in a foreign place and rebel against the complicity of their government in actions that they feel like fundamentally violate their sense of right and wrong and their vision of what they want America to be doing in the world. And I think that movement is growing in a kind of grassroots way. And one of the things that I find most, even though I don't agree with every single form of expression that it takes, I find inspiring the idea that this is a movement that, like other great moral movements, brings together people of all different backgrounds, not around a vision of ethno-nationalism or of group supremacy, but a vision of equality and freedom, irrespective of race, religion, a national origin. And I think that this movement is shaking the foundations of American politics and shaking the foundations of many American institutions. But it faces very, very powerful countervailing forces. And I think that one of the reasons that this struggle over over Palestinian freedom is such a fierce struggle in the United States is that in many ways it is a kind of proxy struggle for what country America wants to be itself. There are forces on the American right that see Israel's Jewish supremacy, Israel's ethno-nationalism as a model for the white Christian nationalism they want in the United States. And there are also, I think, many people on the American right who see the language of decolonization that is used when people talk about in the Palestine solidarity movement as profoundly threatening and frightening to them. Not necessarily even just because they're so worried about what it means in Israel, but because they're at a very deep level, given that the United States is, like Israel, a country that was founded on settler colonialism, that we are also a country that was founded with a myth of a kind of a promised land on a hostile frontier that was created through an act of dispossession of the people who were there, that for many Americans, the Palestine solidarity movement and its vision actually is a threat to their understanding of America, that in threatening the legitimacy of the Israeli state, that many Americans also see it as a threat to the legitimacy of the American state. Because after all, to take these ideas about decolonization and try to apply them in the United States would raise very, very fundamental questions about the nature of our state. I think it's really important to say that decolonization does not mean, should not mean, the expulsion of anyone from the territory. But decolonization does mean, in South Africa, for instance, which has started along the process and has a long way to go, it does mean a process in which you reinvent national identity in ways that end long-standing systems of domination and hierarchy. And that would fundamentally remake not only Israel-Palestine, but it would actually also remake the United States. And I think that explains some of the ferocity of the debate that we've seen over Israel-Palestine in the US, especially since October 7th.
Super, Peter. Thank you so much. So, folks, we're going to do some Q&A. Let me cue this up for us. I wonder whether... So, I think many of us may have strong feelings about this issue, and we're feeling a breathlessness driven by the extreme violence that we're witnessing in Gaza and the West Bank. So we may differ in our opinions, and that's okay. But we're open to hearing from people who disagree. So may I invite us all to just take a deep breath before we go into the Q&A. And then let's open the floor to questions. The way we're going to do that is you can put your question in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and we may rotate between chat and the voice and the verbal questions, just depending on the length of the verbal question. So could you keep your question relatively short so that Peter can answer it and we can accommodate other questions? And Amna, Cole, we need to ask Amna to unmute because she's going to keep track of the questions in chat.
Okay.
There she is. Okay, so I'm going to start. Nana, let's see, I'll ask you to unmute. Nana? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter, for your insight. I've listened to many of your talks before, so I appreciate your perspective. So honestly, I was going to mention that, when Benjamin Netanyahu stood in front of the UN in September of this past year and held up a map where there was no West Bank, there was no Gaza, there was no, actually the map extended into other countries as the Greater Israel. So not to justify anything, but honestly, how do you expect people to take, anything seriously coming out of their government when this is, what their, what his plan is, and great days are to come? This was, his announcement back in September. And then, all the genocidal, vile hatred, talk that has come out of, members of his government, high members of his government. I don't understand how, honestly, I'm finding it very difficult to see how can anyone have this much hate inside them. I don't understand. This didn't happen because of what October 7th happened. This is something that honestly had to have been ingrained throughout your entire life. I don't think if you ask any Palestinian in Gaza now, despite what they've gone through, that they would have any kind of hate for anyone who's Jewish. It was never about religion, because Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in this land for thousands of years together. When the Jews were persecuted in Europe, where did they flee to?
Yeah.
Morocco,
So,
Yemen.
Nana, thank you. I'm going to ask, I don't know if you got to your question or not.
So just, to kind of feel, that, this is where, kind of almost like a little bit of the background of where, this is coming from. How do you even begin to deal with a government like this? And yet our government is very complicit. and they're not listening to the voters. I don't know
Okay,
how many.
great. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, your point about the fact that the Israeli government very routinely and essentially offers maps of this territory that extend from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, in which Israel is the entire territory. And it's not surprising that they do that, because Israel does control the entire territory, right? There is one state, essentially. Now, that state manages its territories differently, right? It controls Palestinians in different ways, but it is the ultimate control in all of this territory, even in Gaza, right? I mean, the reason that people call Gaza an open-air prison is because that's kind of the way Israel controls it. Israel withdrew its settlers in Gaza in 2005, but it still maintained control over the perimeter, right? So if you withdrew prison guards, and then a prison gang was able to run things inside, but you had guards erected around the perimeter and you controlled everyone and everything that goes in and out, you would still be in control of that prison, right? Just like America would be occupying Canada if we blocked off Canada's ability for anything to come in or out without our wishes. So what's frustrating to me is that people get very, very upset when people use the phrase Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, because they imagine that in this theoretical Palestine, Jews would not be safe or would not be treated equally. But when we're talking about the Israel that exists between the river and the sea today, we don't have to imagine theoretically how Palestinians would be treated. Palestinians are not treated equally. Even Israel's own human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, call it an apartheid state, right? So Palestine from the river to the sea would not be my favored slogan. I would rather say I would like Palestinians and Israeli Jews to be free from the river to the sea, because in my imagined vision, I would like this one equal state to be called Palestine-Israel or Israel-Palestine, right? I think to represent the national identities of both peoples in a binational state that provides full equality and makes an effort towards historical justice. But part of the problem, it seems to me, in that we allow expressions of kind of people in American politics don't get upset when they see about one Israel that exists from the river to the sea that denies Palestinians basic rights, because American politics doesn't operate in a discourse in which Palestinians deserve equality. It's simply taken for granted that Palestinians don't. So we have a discourse about anti-Semitism. I am concerned about anti-Semitism. Of course, I'm concerned about anti-Semitism, but we don't even have a language of anti-Palestinian bigotry. There isn't even a term. And I think the reason there isn't a term is because it's so pervasive that essentially it goes completely unnoticed, right? So we ask, is this person anti-Semitic? But if you were to ask the question, is this person anti-Palestinian, you would have to conclude that 90% of Congress would be considered anti-Palestinian, because 90% of Congress, at least, is basically comfortable, if not enthusiastic, about a situation in which Palestinians are not treated equally with Jews. And so I think this is the reason that Benjamin Netanyahu has and his supporters have a kind of respectability in American political discourse, that if we genuinely believe that Palestinians deserve equality and that their lives are as important as the lives of Jews, then they would be seen as bigots, because indeed in their actions there are bigots. Don't have time to psychoanalyze where Benjamin Netanyahu came to his set of his particular perspective and his ideologies, but one doesn't need to look into his heart. One can just look at the policies that he oversees, right? And they are policies that are of oppression. And they're, in which Palestinians are not considered to have the same rights as Israeli Jews.
Thank you, Peter. So I can see that we're not going to get to a lot of questions, but we'll do our best. And I'm sorry in advance to people if you don't get your question answered. Amna, are you?
I'll try to be shorter. It's my answer. Sorry.
Thank you. Amna, are you there? And do you have a question from chat to read?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Peter. Thank you for your very interesting and informative talk. So we have quite a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to try and
Just choose
summarize.
one.
Sorry?
Oh, you can combine.
Like I'm trying to put them together, so that
Okay.
at least bits and pieces of each get answered. So the first one actually is a relatively independent question where some people are asking about what, in your opinion, would be a comparison of Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto, which I believe is something that Norman Finkelstein has also alluded to in some of his talks, talking about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, I guess, as a form of armed resistance, and comparing that to what Hamas did on October 7th.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's not a language that I use. It's not a language that I use, first of all, because I think that associating Israel with the Nazis is, first of all, certainly inside the Jewish community, a very good way of making sure that people stop listening to you. So I don't think it's an effective way of speaking. I also think that I don't think Norman Finkelstein means this way, but I think that to call or compare Israel to Nazis doesn't always necessarily have to, but it can be a way of dehumanizing Israeli Jews. But mostly because I'm not sure, I'm just not sure that the analogy is. I think that there are many historical analogies that we could turn to, and I suppose that for me, I think the most effective thing in talking about Gaza is not to use an analogy to any other situation, but simply to describe the situation of Gaza. And the situation of Gaza is a population of the descendants of refugees who were forced into this territory, not allowed to return to the places they were from, subject to repeated military attack, and also a blockade that has made life in Gaza, even before October 7th, something that the United Nations called unlivable. So for me, I find that's the way that I prefer to talk about Gaza, rather than looking at particular historical analogies.
And could you comment on, there is a clarification to the question where they're looking actually to compare sort of life in the Warsaw Ghetto and life in Gaza.
I mean,
would you see any parallels?
Look, I mean, Gaza is a place in which people are confined, and as I said, like a prison in which they are, and so in that way, yes, that is the way ghettos functioned historically in Europe for Jews. They were places where Jews were confined, and I think that, and it's also a place that has been subject to a tremendous amount of violence by Israel. So even if it's not just that you're confined, it's also that you're denied many of the basics of life, and have been repeatedly attacked. So I think in those ways, yes, I think that it is fair to kind of call Gaza a kind of a ghetto. Again, the term that I tend to use is prison, but I can understand why people would use. I know Masha Gessen has used the term ghetto as well, and I could understand why one would use that term.
Yeah. Amna, shall we go to verbal now? And then we'll come back to the, yes, good. Is it Moji Aga? Did I pronounce that correctly, Moji?
Yes, hi, it's Moji Agha,
Moji.
short for Mujtaba Agha Mohammadi. Hi, Peter. Thank you for what you're doing, especially as a Jew who is concerned about the morality disaster that is befalling the so-called Jewish state. I am Iranian American. I am a persecuted Sufi Muslim. So I am acutely aware of when religion is being used for political or hegemonic purposes. And then I have two quick questions. One,
Can you choose one, Moji?
well, okay, I'll
Please.
well, I mean, one of them was a comment that how Peter feels about Israel becoming increasingly a Goliath. But But the question is that Hamas was in part created or enhanced by the right-wing Israeli state in order to make the conflict into a religious conflict and therefore suppress secular, democratic, national aspirations of Palestinians. And so I see something similar in Iran happening, where religion is being used in order to kill secular democracy. And so I see as Dr. Mossadegh of Iran said, internal despotism and external colonialism are two sides of the same coin. To what extent do you think this unwitting collaboration as enemy between Netanyahu and the so-called supreme leader of Iran is perpetuating a conflict at the expense of the Palestinians and the genocide that is unfolding in Gaza? Thank you for what you're doing. Shalom, brother.
Thank you. I do think it's true that Israel has, in the early years of Hamas, when Hamas emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood, Israel saw it as a more moderate force than the nationalist Fatah movement and the leftist Palestinian movements, and therefore gave the Hamas in its early years, before Hamas began armed resistance, gave it much more freedom to maneuver than the Palestinian nationalist groups. And that's absolutely true. And more recently, I think that, and there are a number of statements by Benjamin Netanyahu along these lines, that Israel saw, because Netanyahu in particular wanted the Palestinians to be divided, because he didn't want to have to negotiate over the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. It was useful to have Hamas there in Gaza, divided from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and therefore Netanyahu saw it as useful to basically keep Hamas there. So I think that's exactly right. And I think more broadly, I think there is a kind of global struggle in many places in the world between two different visions, I would say, of nationhood. One is based on group supremacy, whether that's religious or racial or ethnic or some combination of both. And we see many people, from Narendra Modi in India to Viktor Orban in Hungary to Donald Trump in the United States to Benjamin Netanyahu, proposing that. And then I think what is inspiring to me about the movement in support of Palestinian freedom is that it could be part, it seems to me, of even a broader global movement, which is against the idea of ethno-nationalism in general, right? The same kind of movement that we desperately need in the United States if we want to keep America moving, if we want America to become a country that provides equality under the law for everyone, irrespective of race, religion, and sex, rather than a white Christian supremacist country. The same struggle that's playing out in India, that's playing out in much of Europe. I think this is in many ways the struggle of our times. And I think that's part of the reason that what's happening in Israel-Palestine is so important.
Thank you. Thank you, Moji. So once again, folks, I'm so sorry. We are sorry. We won't have time for all your questions. We're doing the best we can. Amna, do you have another one from chat?
Yep. So this is a question which asks, what is your advice on how to respond to my Israeli father when he says, Israel has no partner for peace, and October 7th once again shows that? And along the same lines is, what would you say would be the best way to approach this discourse within traditional Jewish communities?
That's difficult. Look, I think that if you're in a family or a community where you have deep bonds of connection and love with people, you have to be willing to listen to them, even when they say things that are very painful and that may violate your sense of values. And I think and you also have to be sometimes willing to put aside political differences for the sake of what binds you together in a family. And I believe that the Jewish people were created on the model of the idea of an extended family, B'nai Israel, the children of Israel, that we see ourselves as an extended family. And that's why, for me, it's very, very important to maintain relationships, even with people whose views are very, very difficult for mine. And frankly, I know my views are very difficult for them. I guess what I would say to your father, if I had the fortune to meet him, is that ultimately Israeli Jews and Palestinians are going to have to live together. Israel is not going to be able to expel or kill all the Palestinians. And I don't think at this point partition is possible either. I think that ship sailed quite a long time ago. So the real question, I think, for Israeli Jews is, under what terms do they want to live alongside Palestinians? And if the terms are going to be domination and oppression, then you are going to be inflicting tremendous amounts of violence on Palestinians. And you are going to create conditions that I think are not safe for you. We know that in divided societies around the world, those societies are much safer for everybody when all people in a country have a voice in government and feel represented in government. Because when you have citizenship and the right to vote, then you have a nonviolent means of getting your needs met by the state. And when you don't have that, and the state is not accountable to you and treats and inflicts tremendous violence upon you, it is in those circumstances that people are most likely to violently resist. And people who are in positions of supremacy often imagine that equality will mean their subjugation or death. That's what white South Africans believe. That's what Protestants in Northern Ireland believe. But in fact, what happened was, when apartheid ended, the ANC's military wing disbanded. When Catholics got equality in Northern Ireland, the IRA, which had been blowing up department stores in London, ceased its violent campaign because it had a nonviolent path towards creating a decent life for people. And that's why I truly believe that Israeli Jews, like your father, in the long term, will be safer living alongside Palestinians under conditions of equality.
Thank you. Peter, it simply occurs to me, and I want to lift up a comment from Tina in the chat, that when you mentioned that the question for Israeli Jews is, under what terms do you want to live alongside Palestinians, that I think Palestinians are part of that equation, to ask them, under what terms do you want to live alongside Israelis, right?
Yes, of course. First of all, the question was specifically asked, how would I speak to an Israeli Jew about this question, right? To me, it is self-evident that Palestinians should have a voice and that Palestinians deserve freedom and equality. That doesn't mean that I necessarily am going to agree with every single political decision that a Palestinian political actor takes. I didn't agree with Hamas's decision to kill Israeli civilians on October 7th. I would not agree with Palestinians who believed that they wanted to expel Israel from Jews from historic Palestine, but I think it's self-evident to me that Palestinians deserve absolute equality and also historical justice.
Thank you. I snuck in that question, Peter.
Sure.
We only have 3 minutes left for a question, and Sally, if you can ask your question very, very quickly. Oh, let's see, I'll ask you to unmute.
I think I can ask it quickly. It's related to what the question that just came from chat, actually. I live in Portland, Oregon, and a group of us in the Multnomah Democrats, that's our county, we have submitted a resolution calling on legislators that represent us in DC to do two things: call for a ceasefire now and stop sending weapons to the violence. Some people don't agree with us, and they have created a counter resolution. So they want to compete with us at our meeting this week. Well, we didn't want to compete, and we don't think we should, because they also want what's going on in Gaza to stop, and they want to stop killing people, and they want humanitarian aid. We want similar things, but they have these fears that we're hurting somebody's feelings by using truthful, correct words like genocide, war crime, illegal, complicit, occupation, stuff like that. They won't even say ceasefire. So we don't want to compete. We want our people, our voters, to just pass both, even though we don't like their substitute because it's not truthful enough. But we're going to try to get everybody to approve both. And I want to know if it's a mistake to give up some of our correct, truthful words in order to get this group of people to, be okay with each other, even though that's a whole separate issue.
Sally,
from-
thank you. I'm sorry
what's
for
happening.
interrupting you. Yep.
Gus, I can't really answer that. I mean, I think in political activism, there are questions of strategy and questions of what kind of compromises one is willing to make in order to make tangible gains and gain more supporters. But I don't know enough about the specific circumstances here, I think, to be able to offer you much guidance. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so folks, I'm sorry again that we didn't have time to have Peter answer all of your questions. Thanks to those who posted your questions, and thanks to those who raised your hands. I'm going to call on Mohammed now to present the action that we're asking. So first of all, big thank you to Peter. Could you all give him a round of applause, please?
Everybody's muted, so we can't hear the applause, but
Well,
it's loud.
Well, Peter, if you turn on your gallery, or Cole, turn on gallery view so Peter can see everyone applauding. Can we do that? Can y'all applaud Peter again, please? There you go. Okay. Mohammed, go ahead. We have an action to ask you all to take.
Yes, definitely, yes. We need action. So we need you to contact your member of Congress and urge or implore them actually to call for an immediate ceasefire and de-escalation to save innocent civilian lives, both Palestinian and Israeli. So there will be a link for that, right, on the screen?
Yeah, I put it in there. Is that all you have for the action, Mohammed?
Yes, just to that, I guess, if I understand correctly, that you have a link for people to send a petition to their Congress.
Well, actually, that link is an article.
If there's something you want to add to it, please do, Abby.
I'm gonna put another link as well. 1 second.
So I put in a link that's apparently an article, and Cole's going to add a link for the action that we're asking you to take. Because we need to get our voices out there. All of us are desperate to get a permanent ceasefire, to get food, water, security, medicine, housing, whatever, everything that these poor people need who are living in squalid conditions in tents. Have you seen this? With running sewage, it's just so appalling. So Cole put the action in the chat for you. Peter, we have 3 minutes left.
Can I ask a question from the chat?
Yeah, go ahead.
So where do you see the current investigation of the international ICJ claiming Israeli genocide against the Palestinians? How do you see it proceeding? How far will it go? And are there any actions that we can take to support or convince our government to support this action in any way?
So I'm not an international lawyer, so I can't really make an informed judgment about how likely it is that South Africa will win its case. I do think that what's really critical is that the United States let that process play out fairly. In the past, what the United States has done, certainly with the International Criminal Court, is the United States has used very, very heavy-handed tactics to ensure that the International Criminal Court doesn't begin investigations of Israel, or for that matter, of the United States, for the actions of its soldiers. And, you know, the people around the world see how hypocritical it is when the United States wants to, you know, haul Vladimir Putin in front of the International Criminal Court, but essentially blocks it if it wants to investigate America or its allies. So it seems to me, if the Biden administration likes to talk about this phrase, the rules-based international order, right? So if the international order is supposed to have rules, right, those rules are that countries are fairly investigated for their violations of international law, irrespective of which side of the geopolitical kind of fence they fall on. And I think that's the critical thing for Americans to do.
Super.
Thank
Thank you again, Peter. Cole, is there anything you want to add before we wrap?
Well, I'll just add that for Massachusetts residents, MAPPA has a Gaza-Israel peace campaign. We meet every Wednesday night at 6:30. Be in touch if you're not already on that campaign and wish to join. We have a breakout group for each congressional district dedicated to pressuring that member of Congress to support ceasefire and oppose U.S. further military aid to Israel. And that's an opportunity to get involved. And for those of you in the other 49 states, please do likewise in your own states.
Thank you. You know, I'm just noticing all of the comments in chat. Bravo to all of you. Oh my goodness, people who are bringing resolutions before your city councils. San Francisco's voting on a ceasefire resolution tomorrow. That's just brilliant. Bravo to all of you. Yes, Sharon, I got your message. Thank you. So once again, Peter, thank you so very much. Great to have you. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Oh, Cole, we should tell everyone about the next one. I'm going to put it
Oh, yes.
in chat, which is January 25th, same time, with Jihad Abu Salim. Jihad Abu Salim, who is the executive director of the Jerusalem Fund, which is here in Washington, D.C. He was born and raised in Gaza. At the moment, he's trying to help his family who's still living there, who are living in dire circumstances. He's going to be great. So please join us then. And the publicity will go out in the next few days. So hope to see you then. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.